So today's lesson's on Replacing Darwin, New Origin of Species, Part 1. And I'm using a lot of material from this book called Replacing Darwin, New Origin of Species from Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. And Dr. Jeanson holds a PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University. He serves as a research biologist, author, and speaker with Answers in Genesis, and he formerly conducted research with the Institute for Creation Research. Today's outline is pretty simple, but there's a lot of information. We'll review Darwin's four-part strategy. How did he change the scientific consensus in his day? Because I'll talk about when Darwin was alive, the creationists were ruling. The Christians were in charge. He changed the scientific consensus, and we'll show you how he did that. And maybe we can learn from how he did that to hopefully change it the other way. And we'll talk about reason one to doubt Darwin. You'll see that he knew less than 15% of all species. You know, if he's the expert on species, but he didn't really know how many were out there, how can we trust it? Reason two to doubt Darwin. Darwin tried to answer a genetic question without genetic evidence. And we'll talk about, anybody know when DNA was first understood? It was much later than Darwin's day. So the first question I want to ask is, in replacing Darwin, what would it take to replace Darwin's ideas? I think you're familiar with this, but one of Darwin's most controversial ideas is that all life on Earth is related. We're related to a banana. We're related to an insect because we descended from a common ancestor, primordial slime. These relationships arose not by God causing them to be so, but by natural processes over millions of years. And the theory of evolution is identified by this slogan on the screen, descent from a common ancestor, where all life goes back to a common ancestor. We're related to everything on Earth. And the quote I gave before, from goo to you by the way of the zoo. So what would it take to replace Darwin's ideas? Well, first of all, I want to paint a picture. Darwin changed the ways from the Christian view to the secular evolutionary view. And then you have people like Julian Huxley. He wrote in Evolution After Darwin, and he reflected on the growing interest in the intersection between evolutionary biology to the intersection between human society. And he was a big promoter of Darwin in the mid-20th century and is often referred to as evolutionary humanism. And he believed and promoted that there is no room for the supernatural. And this is what he wrote. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created. It evolved. So did animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, mind and soul, as well as our brain and body. And so did religion. So you could see what he influenced, and more scientists followed this belief system. That's why the Pew Research poll did a survey on scientific consensus on evolution. And they asked the question, humans and other living things have evolved over time. They asked the public and they asked the scientists. The public, those who believed in evolution, 61%, just under 2/3. But the scientists, 97% believe in evolution. And then what about the creation? This is what I view the creation question. Existed in their present form since the beginning of time. And in the public, 31%, almost a third of the public believes in creation. Scientists, 2%. So in the general public, there tends to be a consistent pocket of Bible-believing Christians who believe in creation. However, the scientific community, the numbers are very different. And this 97%, I think, is an actual number. If you interact with a lot of scientists in the scientific realm, very few are Christians. Very few don't even want to entertain creation. But this is not the first time in history when there's a scientific consensus and a small group of people challenged it. We can go back to Charles Darwin because he did, and he changed the consensus. But I want to show you how it's influenced our society in the media. And here's a short clip from creation.com where they show you how everything on television is bent towards evolution. That's why you have large numbers of people believing in it. It's staticky.
Most people believe the Bible is true.
Has science proven the Bible wrong?
Is creation and evolution a side issue?
Our ancestors understood origins by extrapolating from their own experience. How else could they have done it? Then science came along and taught us that we are not the measure of all things.
The simplest explanation is, there is no God. No one created the universe, and no one directs our fate.
You and I are the product of billions of
We share a common
billions
ancestor
of years.
with chimpanzees.
This animal eventually became human.
I'm sorry, but if you don't understand that humans and monkeys came from a common ancestor...
Single out evolution and act as if there's some kind of major scientific dispute, and in fact...
Evolution is a fact, not a theory.
Evolution is a fact. I mean, that's right. There's no question.
Evolution isn't an opinion, it's fact.
Evolution is a scientific fact.
I'm sorry, I believe in evolution.
Lived in the ocean 200 million years ago.
8 million years ago,
We emerged from microbes and muck.
Be able to answer most of these questions now. First Peter 3:15, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that's in you. Any comments on that video? You don't have to, but it's striking how the media just influences the lie of evolution. And it's within TV shows and advertisements. And so let's look at 4 responses to challenge the conventional scientific creation viewpoint that Darwin used in 1859. How did he change from everyone believing in creation to evolution? Well, he used these 4 responses. Number 1, he said, let's review the evidence. And he talked about the evidence of evolution in his preceding chapters in his book. And he said, how could you think any different? The second step he took was, let's consider the time scale of human psychology. People are always slow in changing their mind, he said. Of course, if you look at today's polarized political climate, just like today, it held true back in Darwin's day, where you have the left and the right, and it's hard to change their mind. Point 3, he also had a quote, we're always slow in admitting any great change of which we do not see the intermediate steps. Because he knew it was going to take a while to get out of people thinking creation to evolution. Point number 3, he said, let's consider the obstinacy of human psychology. In other words, in modern English, I'll play this quote, sorry. I by no means expect to convince experienced naturalists whose minds are stocked with a multitude of facts all viewed during a long course of years, from a point of view directly opposite to mine. In other words, in modern English, some old dogs don't learn new tricks. Some people were not going to change their mind, and he was not trying to convert them. Instead, I will look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality. And as fourth point, let's consider the contradiction in the opposing view. So it appears this four-part strategy that was wildly successful, and his book bears out this fact. And this is the 1859 quote from the first edition of his book on the origin of species, and it says, "Why, it may be asked, have all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected this view of the mutability of species?" By 1861, the sentence changed when he updated his book, and he changed it to, "Why, it may be asked, have nearly all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected this view of the mutability of species?" So just 2 years later, there was already a crack developing, thus showing the signs of a future consensus. And then 10 years later, after the first edition, in his 1869 update, the sentence changed to this: "Why, it may be asked, until recently did nearly all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected this view of the mutability of species." So in 10 years, Darwin changed the scientific consensus. They totally rejected Darwin in 1859. They embraced him 10 years later in 1869. So maybe we can take a page from this strategy. So the 21st century of evolution, let's look at Darwin's four arguments and go backwards. Evolution has contradictions, when he said creation had contradictions. Human obstinacy has changed little. Well, has human psychology changed in the last 150 years since Darwin? Are people less obstinate today than they were back then? Based on the Bible, humans are the same unless they're born again, and they will not change. Point two, humans still admit great change slowly. So people are unlikely to change their views, and it'll take a long time to think of something different. And the last point, which was his first point, let's review the evidence. There's been 150 years since he wrote his book. And let's review what has happened since. This will be a history lesson I'll walk you through that you may not have heard, and provide good reason to the 97% of the scientific community that declare that it may be time to replace Darwin. So let's start with his book when it talks about species. What are species? Well, we can go to this secular textbook, Speciation, written by Jerry Coyne and Alan Orr. And this is an interesting story from Papua New Guinea Islands in Southeast Asia. And was it you? Someone said that they've been to Papua New Guinea. Your sister, okay. So what's interesting about this story? There was a guy named Ernst Mayr, and he was a prominent evolutionist with a PhD in ornithology, and that's basically the study of birds. He went to the mountains of Papua New Guinea to study the birds of this region. He tallied and calculated all the bird species. He looked at the different colors, and came up with there's 137 different species of birds in Papua New Guinea. Well, the natives also observed the birds around them, and they're able to distinguish between different bird species as well. Any guesses in the audience what the natives came up with, the number of species of birds in Papua New Guinea? Any guesses? No? Not just one. Remember, they live there, so they see the different birds. They see the red ones and the different colored, different beaks. So they would probably know their area the best, more than this guy, PhD, just coming in and telling them. Any other guesses? It's more than one. Huh? 300? No, a little bit too high, but thanks for guessing. Any others? Okay, I'll reveal it. They came up with 136. So species are intuitively obvious, and it's something we all recognize. It doesn't take a PhD to come up with the different species of birds. I'll start with Carl Linnaeus, and he was a Swedish biologist, and he was the father of modern taxonomy. And he began a catalog, and it was called Systema Naturae. And he documented the species that he was aware of in his time. And this was 1758, and this book is his 10th edition. So he was before Darwin. But many scientists view this as a landmark study when he became the father of modern taxonomy. So we start talking about the first point. Why should we doubt Darwin? Let's look at some observations. Number one, species are intuitively obvious. And let's walk through species on Linnaeus' list to see if this is true. And I need you to assist me on what the species are on the screen, okay? So feel free to speak out when you can. What is that species? Anybody know? Zebra, excellent. And how did you know? You looked at, right, the stripes. Okay. What about that species? Horse. Okay, very good. What about this species? Donkey. What about this species? Okay, good. What about this species? Right. What about this one? Okay. And what about this? Moose. Okay, so Linnaeus gave us what's called a binomial classification system, where we give two names to every species. For humans, our binomial name is called Homo sapiens. It sounds like people in the audience knew that. Homo is the genus name, sapiens is the species name. So what is this species? Buffalo, but there's a more technical term. Bison, yeah, bison. And then the formal name is bison. It's like repeated. Yeah. What about this species? Very good. And the formal name for him is Panther Leo. What about this species? There you go. How'd you know? Exactly. What color is he? Yellow. I'd even say reddish orange. I don't know. Okay, what about this species? What kind? Red fox. I see a lot of these where we live, right, Shannon? They're like running across the street all the time. Do you? Yeah. They're from the dog kind. What about this species? Beaver, good. And what about this one? Okay. This one's going to be tough, but you can give me what's the species generally? And what's the formal name? It's a Barbary macaque. I'm pronouncing it wrong. Now, all these animals were on Linnaeus' list back in 1758. And the reason I wanted to go through to show you how easy it is to identify species. You know, you could make a nice zoo with the mammals that Linnaeus knew of in 1758. All these animals would be classified as mammals because mammals suckle their young, among other characteristics, which classifies them as that. So in 1758, Linnaeus knew less than 200 mammal species. And you went through several of them. Today, guess how many mammal species the scientific community recognizes? Any guesses? We went from 200. What's the number today? Any guess? There won't be any. 100,000, that's way too high. Any other numbers? 1,000. A little bit higher. How about 1,500? Higher than that. Okay. It's up to 5,400 mammal species. So that's a dramatic increase in the last 266 years, going from less than 200 to more than 5,400, right? What happened? What caused this dramatic increase in biological knowledge? Well, that gives us to point number 2, why to doubt Darwin, based on observations. The number of known species has grown dramatically in 266 years. Well, since 1758, we discovered more versions of what we already know. More versions of zebras, you see on the top 3. More versions of horses. More versions of donkeys. More versions of what they call asses, and that's a true name. We now have 7 members of the horse, zebra, and donkey family. 3 zebra species. The lower left on this screen is a Przewalski's horse, right here, which is a wild species. The 2 middle are Asian wild ass species, and the one on the right over there, see the stripes on his legs? That's a striped donkey, which is part of the African wild ass species. So donkeys and zebras and horses can all mate. They're all the same kind. Now there's also differences in the zebra species I showed you. We'll start with the first one, is the plains zebra. And you can see in this picture, the plains zebra has thicker stripes. See that? And it's horizontal on near its rear, and the stripes go around its belly. See that? Also, there are no gaps. The nose is black, and immediately transitions into stripes on its face. And those features are distinguished from other zebras. The plain zebras only look like that. The next one difference in zebra species is the mountain zebra. And notice the stripes are thinner and denser, not as many wide horizontal stripes on its rear, and the stripes don't cross the belly. If you see on the belly, it's white. And it has a dewlap on its neck, right here. I don't know. That's a good question. That's just, and then the third zebra is called the imperial zebra, and its stripes are thinner. No wide horizontal stripes on its haunches, and they don't cross the belly, and it has a white patch, even a brighter white patch on the belly. And it doesn't have the dewlap on its neck, so these are characteristic features of these 3 zebra species. We also have differences in elephant species. This one, anyone, I'll give a clue, has small ears. What kind of elephant is that? From what location? Anybody know? There's difference in elephants. One's from Africa, but the African is there. The big ears, Asian elephant. Asian elephant has a higher skull shape and smaller ears than the African elephant. There's also differences in giraffe species. The regular giraffe's on the left, but that's a giraffe too. Did you know that? It has a short neck. I can give it to you. So the differences in the 2 necks. The 2 horns are similar on the males, and there's a zoomed in one of the other giraffe, and it's called a okapi, I think, O-K-A-P-I. Now, this okapi was not on Linnaeus' list. Anybody know why? Its location. Where do you think it exists at? What country? Any guesses? No, Zaire, Africa. So Linnaeus was a European and a Swede. So when did the Europeans first go to the African interior? And that was in 1813. David Livingstone. Anybody hear of his name? Yep. He was the first European to go to interior Africa. He was born 55 years after Linnaeus' 10th edition. So history plays a role. The globe was not so well known in 1758. Also, the animals in Australia weren't known by Linnaeus. Like marsupials in Australia were not discovered until 1770 with explorer James Cook. So Linnaeus didn't have any kangaroos. He didn't have any wombats. He didn't have any sugar gliders. He didn't have any koala bears. He didn't have any Tasmanian devils or any platypuses. So these were all missing from his list because he didn't even know Australia existed back then. So looking at Africa and Australia mammals, that only adds 250 species. So how do we get to 5,400? Well, those are the majority of the missing mammals: shrews, moles, rodents, rats, mice, and bats. It's hard to miss those large animals, right? The elephants and the zebras, but it's easy to miss these kind of ugly, smaller rodents that people don't want to be nearby, right? But these add 3,700 species to the mammal list. So, 1758, less than 200. Today, do I have an error there? Today, greater than 5,400 mammal species. So, in Darwin's day, there was less than 1,800 mammal species, or only 1/3 of the mammals that we know today. And mammals are just a representative example. In comparison, there's other species, and mammals are only a tiny fraction. We have plant species like the giant sequoia that we saw when we lived out in California. There's also fungal species like pink oyster mushroom on the right. There's also clams and octopus and sharks and caecilian, and those are creatures like frogs and salamanders. And there's birds and bees. So how many total species, not just mammal, how many total species are there today? Any guesses? None heard? 1.6 million species. So in Darwin's day, less than 15% of all the species were known. I'm going to play a clip from Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson where he talks about how Darwin knew less than 15% of the species.
The gray line represents how the number of species that we recognize formally has grown with time. The horizontal axis is a timeline. The vertical axis is the number of species. So you can see as that gray line goes up, the number of species increases with time. Darwin's year, 1859, shows up right there. You can see very little was known. This is a paper from 2011, so
and notice how
they use slightly different methodologies than what I just discussed, and it's a few years ago. So they are not up to 1.6 million, but there's a lot of species there. Notice that there's a big gap between the yellow line, the orange line, and the blue line. That's how much our knowledge has grown in 150 years. By my estimates, Darwin knew of less than 15% of what we know today. But his subject matter, species, he knows less than 15%. He can make that even stronger. See how this line goes up. This paper estimated that the number of known species actually alive on the planet, because that line suggests we're going to keep discovering them, is probably closer to 10 million. In other words, today, 2017, we probably know of less than 20% of what actually exists, which means Darwin knows of an even smaller fraction. So Darwin's writing a book on species, yet he is unaware of the existence of over 85% of them.
So, reason one, Darwin knew less than 15% of all the species. So should we trust his conclusions that were based on less than 15% of the total evidence? No. Exactly. Thank you. Okay. How was Darwin able to overturn the scientific consensus in his day? And we'll talk about that. What is the first thing when you notice this species? Anyone know the name of it? No, smaller. What's smaller than a wolf? Fox. It's Arctic fox. Arctic fox. Notice, bright white fur coat, right? He uses that as camouflage against the snowy, white Arctic environment. In fact, if he closed his eyes, you probably couldn't even see him in the snow. And he has a thick coat that insulates him against the frigid cold temperatures. Other species also survive in the Arctic environment. Anybody know what that one is? Right, polar bear. Now that was documented in 1774. Here's another species. Can you even make it out? Yeah. That's his eye. And see how he camouflages? He's the Arctic hare, and he was discovered in 1819. What about this? Further south you find, we already said it, red fox. Now what purpose does his red coat serve? Exactly. How many red foxes do you see in that picture?
I see one with a reflection.
Yeah, don't count the reflection. Can you see one kind of in the back there? Near the top of the screen? Yeah. See how it camouflages a little bit? Yeah. So the red coat, like you said, helps camouflage. Now black bears blend in better than white grizzly bears, right? We can go farther south and you find, anybody know what that is? Yes, jackrabbit. What do you notice about this species?
Big ears.
Exactly. And there's a reason for the big ears. This rabbit has a challenge of extremely hot temperatures in the south. So the rabbit has to stay cool, and the big ears is a way to get rid of his body heat. He does this by increasing circulation through his ears to help radiate body heat to stay cool. So, species, do they fit their environment? Would you design an Arctic fox or the red fox any differently? It appears these animals were designed for their environments, right? What about polar bear and black bears? Do they fit their environment? Okay, and then the rabbits, the two rabbits we talked about, they fit their... What about the zebra? Even the zebras appear to fit their environment with a camouflage effect. They're in the patch of woods and it's hard to see them, right? Yeah. So no matter where you go across the globe, Africa, North America, South America, Asia, you'll find species that seem to fit their environment, as if they were designed by some master designer for that environment. This was the scientific consensus in the days before Darwin. So he started using arguments against this. He used arguments for biogeography, anatomy, embryology, and paleontology. From 1758 to 1859, the species and knowledge of the fields of science increased. The world expanded. David Livingstone penetrates Africa. We know more about the globe with the discovery of Australia. So I'm going to play short clips where Darwin argued using biogeography, and he uses our knowledge, the Christian knowledge, against them, because the Christians of the day didn't understand DNA and adaptation and stuff like that. This is like a minute and a half.
Darwin says, well, let's think about the new geographical data that we possess. This is the type of argument he would have made. So I've shown here one of the three zebra species, but I'm showing in red the geographic locations of all three zebra species. They're indigenous, native only to Africa, from South Africa up to near Ethiopia. That's where you find them in the wild today, and only there. And they seem to fit, they seem to be designed for this tropical savanna environment, that sort of thing, where they can blend in. Darwin comes along and says, okay, I'll concede that point. They do look like they're designed for that environment. But Africa is not the only location where we find these tropical savannas. You can find them, and I've shown them here on the screen with red stars, in northern India on the border with Nepal. You can find them in northern Australia. You can find them in Brazil. You can find more temperate grasslands in the United States. Go to the Great Plains, go to Nebraska, go to Kansas. You won't find zebras there. You won't find zebras native to Brazil or to Asia or to Australia. That was Darwin's question then. Why, if zebras were designed for Africa, if zebras were designed for the savannah, why don't you find them in every place you find a savannah? If the designer took such great pains to make them for this environment, why didn't he put them in every instance of that environment? That was Darwin's challenge. That was one of the fields of science that he drew on, geography, biogeography.
Darwin's argument number 2, anatomy and physiology, and he'll talk about that argument.
Another field was anatomy and physiology. So if you were to take your forearm, strip away the skin and hair and muscle and nerves and blood all the way down to the bone, it looks something like this on the left. And it's been color-coded so that you can see the order of the bones. 1 in tan, 2 bones in red and white, and then in the wrists you have in yellow bones, and then the fingers. And it's color-coded for a reason. The 4 limbs of the other species that are shown here on the screen, their 4 limbs are a dog, bird, and whale. They also have 1, 2 wrist bones, fingers, but obviously very different. The whale bone is much shorter. Obviously, the bird fingers are much different than our fingers. There's obvious differences, and Darwin would have said, yes, there's obvious differences in what you see here. But there's an underlying shared pattern. 1, 2, wrists, fingers. In every case, the human, dog, bird, whale, same pattern. 1, 2, wrists, fingers. And evolutionists make this argument to this day, and they say, if you were designing a forelimb from scratch, there's 1,000 different ways you could do it. Why is it that when we look to biology, we find this one pattern, or a small set of patterns? Darwin said the only explanation must be these guys inherited this pattern from a common ancestor that had the 1, 2, wrists, fingers pattern. So he drew on that field.
So he was using that as an argument, well, all the animals have the same pattern, so we probably came from a common ancestor and evolved, but that's not the case. And then point number 3, embryology. We'll talk about that.
He drew on the field of embryology. Here's a diagram that's actually in a book I've published.
We talked about this.
It's not one of Ernst Haeckel's fake diagrams of embryological development. This is try to make it as close as possible to reality. These are 5 very different species, from left to right: turtle, frog, mouse, chicken, zebrafish. And I've shown you different developmental stages. So the bottom row represents the early, probably shortly post-conception stage in these various species. The middle row is a later stage, a middle stage, I should say, the Pharyngula stage. And the late stage is up top. And by the late stage, it becomes fairly obvious what's what. No one's going to confuse which one's the turtle and which one's something else. You can already see in the chicken the beak forming, the early wings forming. The mouse embryo, the late stage in the middle, looks like a mouse. The frog tadpole stage is apparent. You can see the zebrafish stage. So there's differences at the late, differences early. The Pharyngula stage is where there's a question. So look at that first column on the left, the turtle column, compare it to the chicken column. The Pharyngula stage in particular, that middle row, they're almost identical. It's very hard to distinguish them. If I showed you these two and you didn't know anything about what was going on, I just identify what species this is, I'd have trouble doing it. Darwin would have asked, why is that? Why is there similarity? You can design the developmental program any which way you want to. Why is there this similarity? Must be due to common ancestry, that all of life is connected and they've inherited things from these ancestors. Another field of science, embryology.
And then fourth argument's paleontology.
Fourth field of science, paleontology, fossils. Darwin recognized this as a problem in his day. Said, well, I hope we'll find these transitional forms, creatures that blend the features of 2 very different species. Today, evolutionists would say, well, we found them. This is Tiktaalik, published 2005, 2006. It seems to blend the features of fish and land species. It has scales like a fish, a head like an amphibian or a reptile, and limbs that look like half fins, half legs. Seems like the perfect connection between oceanic creatures and land creatures, as if life evolved from the oceans onto the land. That's what Darwin would have said had he had this evidence available to him.
So how was Darwin able to overturn the scientific consensus in his day? He used evidence on biogeography, anatomy, embryology and paleontology. So in his day, conclusion was case closed. And he said the view of scientific community changed, was for 150 years, and this remains this way. That's why 97% of scientists believe it today. Now, there's one critical field of science missing when we talk about species. Can anyone guess what that is? What's missing here that we found? Exactly. Genetics, DNA. They didn't know that back then. That's a big difference. So, species are defined by their traits. What defines those traits? And we said that species, we see it's intuitively obvious. Better use this. What defines those traits? They are inherited consistently from generation to generation. So species-specific, plain zebras only produce plains zebras, okay? Not mountain zebras or imperial zebras. Those traits are inherited consistently from generation to generation. African elephants produce only African elephants. They do not produce Asian elephants. So species traits are defined by inheritance. They have to be. If you have an elephant in one generation gives birth to a snake, the next generation the snake gives birth to a bird, and then the next generation the bird gives birth to a fish. If there was a massive change every generation, we would not be having this discussion on species, right? The term species would not exist in our dictionaries. Oops. So what defines inheritance? Species traits are defined by inheritance. What about this tiger? What's the origin of the reddish fur? How would Darwin answer this question in 1859? I have the answer for the red color in the tiger species. Answer, inheritance. So what about inheritance tells you the red hair shows up in the tiger species and not other species? Did red hair you see red hair only in tigers? Well, we see red hair in other species. What about humans? Humans have natural red hair, right? We've seen red-haired folks. This includes Central Asians. Here's a child from Western China who has red hair. Also, red hair appears in humans in Papua New Guinea. Where did the red and blonde hair come from in the picture here? You got a woman with looks like red hair, and the other girl maybe some blondish hair. What defines certain features and traits and what doesn't? There's a global distribution. So let's look at families, and we'll start getting into recessive genes. So he's going to talk about a few families that have red hair.
So there's some families where one parent has red hair and the other parent doesn't. So in this case, I'm showing you a family. Dad has dark hair, mom has red hair, and every single one of her daughters has red hair as well. Why is that? Can we predict when children have red hair and when they don't? There are families where dad has dark hair, mom has red hair, and none of the children have red hair. Why is that? How do you explain that? What predicts who gets red hair and who doesn't? Does it just appear and disappear at random? Could it be other colors that eventually appear? Could humans eventually have blue hair? That's a legitimate question without the knowledge of inheritance. I've talked about hair color. We can talk about hair quantity. Is there a time, do we know what defines a lot of hair or a little hair? Could we eventually have a lot of hair? Did our ancestors have a lot of hair? That's a real question when we're talking about evolution, because they would say that our ancestors did. Tigers, humans have red hair. We already looked at a species that has red hair as well. Another one, foxes, red foxes, orangutans have red hair. What defines when red hair shows up and when it doesn't? If orangutans and humans have red hair, does that mean we have a common ancestor? When does red hair show up? When does it not? And why? There's a lot of puzzles and paradoxes when you start thinking more deeply about inheritance. Now that we have microscopes, those paradoxes increase.
Okay, what species does this belong to? It's a 10-day-old embryo. Anybody guess what species that is? Right, that's good answer, right? It's hard to tell, right? It's only 10, it could be anything. Okay, let's go further in time. What species does this belong to 30 days? Yeah, that's a guess. Any other guesses? Chick? Yeah, I can see that. Okay, so what about 65-day embryo? It grows a little bit more. Now what's it look like? A lamb? Why you say lamb? Because of the feet? Okay, could be a horse, lamb, okay. What about 20 days later, 85-day embryo? But you can see some hooves there, right? The head, and I think you're making out a tail. Now, I'll show you the image at birth, because there won't be a debate. And here's what it is. A horse. At birth, species are immediately recognizable, right? Species are defined by their traits. All these traits define us, that define the horses, define the zebras. They get completely erased at conception and rebuilt every generation. This is where we're going with this. This is where next lesson, we're going to talk about that, how each generation is a new creation, but there's also things that are left behind. We become more mutant. You can calculate the mutations with each generation, even though it's a renewal each time. So we want to know, say, the origin of red hair. What does red hair appear? Why does red hair appear on some people and not others? There was one family where all the kids were red, and the other family where none of the kids were red hair. It deals with the genes. I'll give you the answer. The family that had all the red hair girls, the father must have had a red hair gene in conception, because the mother, she only gave red hair, but the father had to have a recession gene that's red for all the other family. The father probably had no red hair at conception.
I always heard that to have red hair, both parents had to have red hair.
Yes, but the father had dark hair, but he had a red hair gene in him that wasn't shown yet. It was hidden. Like my kids, I have blue eyes, but none of them adopted that. But they have that now in their gene pool. So when they have kids, if they have a blue-eyed, mate, they could have blue-eyed kids. Okay, so there are much bigger questions that have to be answered. Not everything that defines our features gets erased or rebuilt every generation, and species traits are defined by inheritance. So you could see the zebra. They're known at birth as well. So point number 3, inheritance is a complex set of paradoxes. So what did Darwin know about these paradoxes in 1859? Right, exactly. The first steps towards resolving those paradoxes were not even taken until 1865. So most genetic textbooks began in the mid-1860s. When Darwin came without his book, there was nothing about genetics. So let's examine, anybody hear of Gregory Mendel? Okay. He was an Austrian monk. In 1865, he published experiments in plant hybridization, and he solved the paradox of family trees. Why does one family have red hair and the other one didn't? And he documented inheritance in pea plants. And Dr. Nathaniel Jeeson will talk about this.
We're looking at the color of the peas. He could get pure breeding yellow peas, pure breeding green seeded pea plants. So if you just keep self-fertilizing them, same outcome, same outcome. If you cross them, which is what Mendel did, he did hundreds of crosses, counted thousands of peas, he discovered something very interesting. So doing that experiment, yellow with green, all of the offspring, the F1 generation, first filial generation, were yellow. No mix of the two, no green whatsoever, not yellowish green, just yellow. So this was his first observation, first conclusion. Mendel concluded that inheritance must be defined by unit factors. That's the term he came up with. What other term is there? There's something that's quantifiable, something that's distinct and discrete. It's not yellowish green, it's either yellow or green, and when you cross them, only yellow. There's some factor that encodes that. That doesn't answer all of our questions, though. You immediately see and begin to, if you look at this result and you say, well, what happened to green? Did it get destroyed? If that green pea plant was the last living green plant on the planet, did he just make it go extinct? Well, he self-fertilized the F1 generation and was able to recover green. And so this was his second inference. Green wasn't destroyed, it was hidden. These unit factors, whatever they are, the genetic information, whatever defines inheritance, can be hidden. In this case, yellow was dominant. When yellow and green are crossed, green is still present in those offspring, it's just hidden. When green and yellow occur together, yellow dominates green, green is recessive. And this occurred in very specific mathematical ratios. When he self-fertilized those F1s, 1/4 of the time, 25%, the offspring were green, 3/4, 75% were yellow in the F2 generation. Well, what does that mean? He took this experiment one step further. He took those F2 plants, self-fertilized them, and I've got lines going down the screen so you can follow to the next slide, the outcomes. I've got this large diamond with the individual diamonds in there so you can see them, follow the green. When he self-fertilized those behaved as if they were pure breeding green. Always green, next generation, always green, always green. The yellow ones came in a couple different varieties. Look at the blue shaded diamond, follow that yellow pea plant. When he self-fertilized 1/3 of his F2 yellow plants, they acted like pure breeding yellow. Only yellow, only yellow. 2/3, the peach shaded boxes, gave rise to that same F2 result, 3-to-1 ratio. Without going into the details of the math, what Mendel inferred, the only way he could make sense of these results, was to postulate that the unit factors for yellow and for green, where there was dominance and recessive, they must have segregated from one another. There were other experiments that Mendel did.
Okay, and that's the next short video.
For our purposes, this explains why red hair behaves in the manner that it does. Red hair is a recessive trait. It's encoded by recessive unit factors. So the only way it shows up is if both unit factors in a particular individual, in this case mom, say red. And mom is going to pass on one unit factor to offspring, dad is going to pass on another. If dad has no red unit factors, none of the offspring will have red hair. Red will be silent. It'll be hidden, just like green was in the F1 generation. In the family where mom had red hair and every single one of her daughters had red hair, dad must have had a unit factor for red. Well, his hair wasn't red. That's because it was in hidden form. Dad must have had something that says non-red and red. This is going to dominate red, and so he passes on that red to his offspring. Mom is always going to pass on only red, and hence the redheaded daughters. Those were the first steps taken towards understanding what defines inheritance, and it was taken after Darwin. Mendel's results were lost then for several decades, rediscovered around the turn of the century.
So any thoughts on that? Does that help you understand? Yeah, Pastor.
Mark, it wasn't too long ago that I saw in a magazine or a newspaper online that a Caucasian couple gave birth to a black.
Yep.
Kind of goes along with that.
Yep. It was a recessive gene that they had in them. Yep. Now I have a clip. It'll go over 3 minutes, but he'll talk about the history of DNA, and I think this is important for you to hear this.
Scientists began to look at sperm and egg, these cells that define inheritance. That's what gets passed on. They connected Mendel's principles to structures in these cells, chromosomes. We have chromosomes in our cells, 46 of them. This is an actual image of it, 23 pairs. This is what encodes then. This is what the scientists concluded then. This is what defines red hair. 10 fingers, a head, 10 toes, 2 legs, so forth. This is where the tiger stripes are encoded in the tiger chromosomes. That was only a partial answer, though, to this question, because chemically, chromosomes are made of 2 major chemical molecules, DNA and protein. The DNA is shown in that twisted ladder-like structure. The proteins are showed by those yellowish plugs. And for many years, scientists thought it was proteins, not DNA, that were the substance of heredity. It took many decades for this debate to be resolved. It wasn't resolved until Watson and Crick in 1953, and among others, discovered the structure of DNA that I just told you about. This was unknown before then. They solved it. And it was at that point that the scientific community finally settled on and resolved this question. Yes, it's DNA. DNA must be where, in some coded form, because this is a chemical, not a book of English instructions, there must be something that says red hair, tiger stripes, orangutan fur, so forth. Orangutan hair. This is where it's encoded. This is also not the end of the story, because once you settle on DNA as the substance of heredity, now the question is, well, what is it? What is the code in us that says human? What is the code in that 10-day-old horse embryo that says you're going to take this sphere and sculpt 4 legs and a tail and a head that looks like a horse and eventually the coat color and so forth? What is it about DNA that does that? And to answer that question, you've got to get the actual sequence. So that began a new long study, and again, I'm zooming through this history fast. You can see this timeline here on the horizontal axis. The first time point is Darwin, 1859. 1953 is the structure of DNA. Nearly 100 years after Darwin publishes his work, DNA is recognized as the substance of heredity. Late 60s, the first DNA sequences were solved from viruses by and large, because they have the smallest DNA sequences, the easiest technology-derived science. It wasn't until 1997 that these databases finally passed the 1 million mark. That doesn't mean we have the DNA sequence from all 1.6 million species. Far from it. What it means is we have a few select creatures, a few select species with a lot of sequences. So humans have tens of thousands of DNA sequences in our public databases. E. coli has countless. So we're still trying to get the DNA sequences from the creatures around the globe. My point is, using 1997 as the landmark, for most of the last 150 years, highlighted in red, we've had no genetic information.
None.
Species are defined by traits. Traits are defined by inheritance. It's DNA that defines inheritance. You want to know the origin of species, you've got to know the origin of the DNA that defines them. Darwin couldn't do it. No one could do it. Until now. Darwin took a massive scientific risk, and he admitted as much. Chapter 5, the summary section of his book, says our ignorance of the laws of variation is profound. A critic might say, well, he doesn't use the term genetics. True. That's because the term genetics wasn't invented until the early 1900s. That's how primitive the knowledge of genetics was in 1859. What I've just told you isn't necessarily a bombshell. It has bombshell implications for the origins debate, but the evolutionists have basically conceded what I've just said.
So evolutionists agree. Here's a book on Adam and the genome. And he wrote, Darwin, like all biologists of his day, save Gregor Mendel, who was working in isolation and essentially unknown, Darwin was confused about how heredity worked. Genetics, DNA sequencing, and comparing whole genomes between species have thus been a great boon to evolutionary science, but they have also been potentially a great threat. Evolution as a theory could have been completely upended by those scientific advances. So this quote says there was a big looming risk hanging and waiting to be resolved with the advent of modern genetics. Point 4, paradoxes weren't solved until long after Darwin. Some of the paradoxes are still being worked on. The origin of the human species and red hair. The answer is found in what? Right, DNA. The answer is found in DNA. How does the zebra get its stripes? Exactly. The answer found in DNA. So species are defined by their DNA, the concept that wasn't recognized until long after Darwin died. So reason number 2 for Darwin. Why try to answer a genetic question without any genetic evidence? Why would Darwin write a book on the origin of species long before anyone would have had direct data to answer where the origin of species came from? And how could we have an intelligent discussion like about E. coli or microbes before the invention of the microscope? Can we talk about the origin of species without any genetic data? Doesn't make sense, does it? So why doubt Darwin? We talked about reason number 1. Darwin knew less than 15% of all the species. So should we trust conclusions that were based on less than 15% of the total evidence? Hmm?
Did Darwin know that he didn't have all the evidence?
He knew from what he could compile in his day. And then, right. Well, he didn't even know. Remember, they didn't know what existed. Exactly. Good point, Michelle. Yep. Yes.
That happens in probably 90% of the master and PhD degrees today, where they get some data that does not prove what they want and they just don't use it. But my view on Darwin is, I'm not against the guy itself. I mean, he had a good rationale, and he created some information based on what he thought was true. My problem today is with the scientist that still believes with all the information that they have today. I don't even challenge the scientists of his days because he came with answers that they didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying that the answers they were correct, but they were at least answers. Yeah. But today they have access, they can have different answers, and they keep trying to prove the same thing that deeply they know it's wrong, but they want to believe it.
Yeah, good point.
Darwin, 200 species? He had no concept how many species, so, he was just really doing a whole lot.
And then also, I think you touched on reason number 2. Darwin tried to answer a genetic question without DNA. Why try to answer a fundamental genetic question without any genetic evidence? So evolutionists can see that this is fundamentally a genetic question. But why aren't the 97% of the scientists being converted to creationism? Well, at least 60% are professed atheists. Next week, we'll discover the new model to replace Darwin. Science is a work in progress, and I think, Hallinson, you were getting at that. And just as it was in Darwin's day. But also, they suppress the truth and unrighteousness. And Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, when he wrote his book, he was trying to debate anyone, all comers. They wouldn't take him on. They kind of pushed him aside. Get away from me. I don't want to hear you. So, right. Well, now it's built on narratives, and you won't get published unless you toe the line of what they hold to.
Scientists would admit, okay, there's new this information, this is wrong. This is what we know now, that was wrong. Well, why they hold on to it is just evil.
Yep, and it takes time. It was probably easier for Darwin to switch in 10 years because going with a Christian viewpoint, anti-Christian. Going back the other way is going to be more challenging, as we know about the spiritual realm. I wanted to end with this video. It does go 6 minutes, but I think it's powerful because it talks about They're interviewing kids at college and trying to figure out why did they leave the church. And the premise is they weren't given answers. But we know God's sovereign and he chooses who he wants. But it's a way that we should be teaching our children the truth so they're equipped to answer these questions. So if you don't mind, I was going to play this. I think you'll find it interesting, and then we'll end.
The surveys that indicate 66 to 88% of young people are leaving the church never to return. I can relate to this problem. Growing up in a Christian home, I saw many friends walk away from the faith. So a team from CMI conducted on-site interviews with youth on university campuses in the United States. We went looking for young people who identified as Christians. And you will see a direct correlation with those who've remained in the faith and those who've left the church. Now, hopefully this becomes relevant to your area of leadership as you hear firsthand from these sons and daughters. Now, please let me preempt what you are about to see. The first section features students who said they no longer regularly attend church. Sadly, it was the majority we interviewed. And at the end, you will see just the handful that we could find who said they still regularly attend church.
So when it comes to creation or evolution, which do you believe?
I'd probably have to say evolution.
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 So you were not brought up in the church, you didn't have a church background at all?
I actually did, but I didn't care for religion being shoved down my throat so much, so I kind of went down the other path.
Were you ever raised in the church? Do you ever have a church background at all?
I was raised Catholic.
Okay, in your background, were you ever exposed to any scientific teaching or evidence that you thought creation might be true?
Nothing in particular, no.
Do you still attend church today or not anymore?
Only for holidays.
Have you ever been exposed to any scientific arguments for biblical creation at all in your life that you can think of?
No, I don't think so.
So you've never had any exposure to Christian beliefs or teaching at any stage?
I went to church with my family up until like age 4 or 5, but after that we moved and I stopped going, or we kind of stopped going together as a family. But
what do you believe in?
Kind of both, in a way. I think it's more of a how instead of a why, in my belief.
I believe, in a way, religion is the why and science is the how.
Did you used to attend church? And if you did, do you still attend church today?
We used to, but we kind of just grew tired of it.
In your church background, were you ever exposed to any scientific evidence for creation from, your youth pastors or church leaders? Did you have any organization in that kind of helped you understand that biblical creation might be scientifically viable?
No.
All right. Do you still go to church today? Still attend church today?
I do.
Creation or evolution? What do you believe?
That's a bold question. I'm not quite sure.
Were you ever exposed by your church leaders, youth pastors, something like that, about any scientific evidence for creation?
No.
Still go to church now? Or
No.
what do you believe?
Creation. I think that the genetic sequence can change over time, over millions and billions of years.
Right, so do you kind of have a hybrid view of creation? Do you think that God used some sort of evolutionary process? Is that what you're describing?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. In your church background, were you ever exposed to any scientific evidence teaching about for creation by your church leaders, pastors, anything like that?
Definitely not.
Were you raised in a church background at all? And do you still go to church today?
Yes, raised. Not as regularly as I should go, though.
we were created, but we're created to evolve. So I believe in both, really.
So when you say creation, and it's a bit of a hybrid, obviously that's because of your church background. Were you exposed to any scientific evidence by your pastors or youth leaders to support the biblical account of creation?
No. My whole family's Christian, but we didn't really go to church that much, so.
When it comes to creation or evolution, what would you say you believe in more?
Evolution.
Right. Were you ever raised in a Christian background in the church at all?
Yes, I was.
In your church background, were you ever exposed to any scientific evidence by your church leaders, pastors? Did they have a creation group in who presented any information to you that gave you the idea that creation might be scientifically viable?
No, I don't believe so.
Do you still attend church today at all?
On the major holidays, Christmas, Easter. That's about it.
Okay, thank you. So was there any weight of evidence or any strong argument that kind of gave you a aha moment that you kind of realized evolution might be true?
So I guess around middle school when they first introduced it, just seemed like that was a bit more logical and seemed like more.
Right. What type of area of science, though? Was it something like, fossils, genetics, or in your area, physics, distant starlight issues?
I believe genetics. So, seeing how the genes were changing over time, that was kind of like, it's happening. We can't say it's not. So
it's just like some animals just change over time, just in general. It's like if you just look at some animals change, it happens.
Okay, so let's end with this verse, Psalm 100, verse 3. Know that the Lord, He is God. It is He who has made us, and not we ourselves. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture.